Kick it. You wake up late for school, man, you don't wanna go. You ask your mom please, but she still says no. Man, living at home is such a drag. Now your mom threw away your best porno mag. Busted. You have to fight for your right to party.
Welcome to the For All That podcast, episode number 14. As usual, your host this week is me, Andrew Tickell, and I'm joined, as usual, by Michael Greenwell. How are you going, Michael?
I'm going alright. Still looking forward to the day when I can disagree with Brian Souter in an independent Scotland as much as I disagree with him usually on the United Kingdom.
Happy question time, eh?
Yeah, I just watched it. It was horrible.
And we're also joined this week by Craig Gallagher, all the way from Boston. Last week, Nemo found him, but how did you find Nemo, Craig?
Hi guys. Nemo was cold, windy, rather terrifying, but after the fact, rather enjoyable. You always imagine on snow days that you're going to see 100 people involved in a spontaneous snowball fight. Well, I can now say I have in fact seen that.
It's always great when that happens, though.
The only time I've ever seen it before was when it snowed in Glasgow, and I think because I always used to attribute it to the fact that people had never, they don't really get much snow at all. So I had this idea that people here, being so used to it, would be a lot more cynical about it. But this week's snowstorm was, I think, pretty unprecedented. They're harking back to 1972 is the last time they had something this serious.
Oh, there you are. So you were tobogganing and frolicking and such.
I wasn't. I was sitting inside with a hot chocolate, tutting all the crazy young people outside. But I'm sure they enjoyed themselves.
See, that was not the spirit of the frontier that took Scotsmen across the face of America. No, I'll just sit in and have a hot chocolate. Shame on you. Anyway, and Craig, you are a doctoral student, aren't you, at Boston College, studying history?
Yeah, exactly. I'm studying a PhD at Boston College, which is the Jesuit university in Boston. Although that is just a fact that I'm throwing out there. It's very interesting in and of itself. But I came into it with an interest in early modern Britain, 17th, 18th century political environment, and increasingly I've got interested in the empire. So I find myself more and more talking about Scots and their kind of role in the empire. And one of my big questions is, how true is this story that the Union was all about the Scots trying to get access to the British Empire? Increasingly, I'm finding that they actually had pretty good access to it before the fact. And so, at some point, I'd like to write something that asks that question.
That sounds very interesting, actually. And it's certainly a well-trodden path about this image of the thrusting young Scotsmen that were, dispatched by Henry Dundas and so on to take over India and Africa and you name it, really.
Actually, the conversation I had last night, I recorded a podcast last night with two guys in Zambia, and they were talking about how the Scots role very often was, in the history of where they were, was very often helping the natives against the empire, and it's not quite as clear a picture as people seem to think.
Yeah, you see examples of that all over the place. My favourite one in Boston is there's a charity called the Scots Charitable Society of Boston, but it was founded in 1651 by soldiers who were deported by Cromwell when he conquered Scotland. And so, you get all these institutions that they're very important to the city. This charity still exists today. It's a long-standing, almost Masonic institution. But, these things predate the Union. They have all these other contexts that I think it's useful to look at them instead of just considering them as straightforward. The Scots needed empire, so they joined the English Union and the British Union and so on and so forth. But again, I still have a long way to go before I can answer anything more concretely than that.
That's I very much sympathise with that. The PhD is long, lonely, hacking away at the kind of cold face of misery and despair. No, maybe just me.
It's definitely not just you, no.
I find it reassuring, actually. I know most of my pals in Oxford are doctoral students, which probably doesn't make them a very representative sample, but they've all gone through the despair. So there's solidarity from me with you on that one. Obviously, from this week, just to go into the sort of Scottish politics angle, this week there's been loads going on in the referendum debate and about politics. Perhaps the biggest splash was the UK government's publishing on Monday of legal advice from Professors Alan Boyle and James Crawford from Cambridge University about international law aspects of independence. And this was clearly hoped by the UK government, I think, to sow a sense that isn't independence awfully tricky? Isn't it a waste of time? Couldn't we just sit in our pants instead in front of the telly? And instead of renegotiating all of these treaties, and isn't it awfully difficult? I think that was what they were kind of trying to promote, but it didn't go terribly well, I don't think. It didn't go quite as they hoped in terms of its public impact when one of their professors disagreed with their interpretation in public. But one of the big things this week, which was taken out of the report and used by sort of Nats, I suppose, politically, to kind of stir up a little frustration, was a claim made by the professors that Scotland, when it joined the Union in 1707, was extinguished as a matter of international law. And I noticed that loads of folk on Twitter and the SNP in their press releases jumped on this kind of extinguished idea with great gusto and enthusiasm. I know neither Craig or Michael, you are particular international law scholars, but I wonder what you make of why folk jumped on that particular phrase and found it so frustrating and irritating. Craig?
I think because the starting point for that is that we're told so often that Scotland exists within the Union and that it's a nation, and this is something you hear from both sides of the conversation, that there is something already of a country about Scotland, and so its position within the Union kind of helps to keep that extant, keep that going. And then for the UK government's own legal advice to turn around and say, well, in this particular context, not so much. There's clearly a question here. Incidentally, I think it was given more legs than it might have otherwise got by David Mundell, and his quite happy to argue the point in the paper, despite it being something of a PR disaster. But I think from the point, I should say that I think there's something to the argument that legally Scotland ceased to exist, if only because the whole idea of the British Union was to extinguish both states and bring them together as a new state, under a new monarchy, the monarchy of Great Britain, which obviously had existed since the 1603 union between the two crowns when Scottish King James VI took the throne. But I don't necessarily buy the idea that the other thing that was in the report was this idea of Scotland being absorbed into a greater England, which I think is something that a lot of the Nats online and so on and so forth have really kind of jumped on as well. There's more to the argument, I think, that both countries were extinguished to form a new one than any sense to which, however politically realpolitik it may in fact be to say that England somehow absorbed Scotland. I think perhaps it seems to me that that's the point of contention for a lot of people.
Yeah, one of the things about it as well is for a lot of Scottish people, and not just people who support independence, also others, one of the things that people find annoying, like with what Craig said, we're often told we exist within the Union, but we go abroad and you're from Scotland, oh, England, and that thing where like feeling, hello, we're here, we're not England, hello, we're here, and then if there's a kind of legal document that maybe says they don't exist, people are going to react to that as we are here, we do exist. Someone actually said that I don't mean to go off the point legally with it, I'll come back to you with that, Andrew, but like someone said, well, it shows you how far law is away from from reality, because if you think Scotland doesn't exist, then that's just mad. Like what the law says on a piece of paper is so far removed from the actual reality on the ground that it's not even worth listening to.
No, I think that there's a degree to which I would entirely sympathise with that law isn't a description of reality as it's perceived. It doesn't exhaust all of the various perspectives we might have on a phenomenon. And actually, I thought what was interesting about this was that the professors, and particularly Crawford, who was speaking in public, he was very alive to the modest limits of what law could do. That yes, there is this international law there are these understandings about it, But one of the big stories in this report was that it's all about politics. It's about negotiation. It's about compromise. Law can be superseded by all of these other things. And I think that's really the big message, which I was struck by reading through the report. But I was interested in something you said there, Craig, because I was reading recently a book, which I imagine you probably are familiar with, by Colin Kidd, called Union and Unionisms. And one of his big arguments is that unionism as a sort of concept, as a political argument, was a sort of small n nationalist way of avoiding this kind of incorporating union with England. It was a way of preserving a sort of Scottish distinctiveness within the union, which actually did bear fruit, I suppose, in terms of the fact that nowadays you meet almost nobody in Scotland who isn't a nationalist. The question is what that nationalism should mean in terms of nation-stateness.
I think that's a good point, and I think Kidd's real sort of contribution to this has been to emphasise that it might not be quite as neat a dichotomy between unionism and nationalism as we assume, as modern political realities dictate. I'm actually a big fan of Colin Kidd. I've been in the same room with him once and found him to be very gregarious. He teaches in Belfast, I believe. He has another fascinating argument about Scots and the Union that has to do with the importance of Presbyterianism and the Covenanting tradition in terms of what Scots were prepared to preserve and what they were prepared to give up. So political liberty was less important to them, for example, than religious liberty, because of their experience of the previous 100 years of persecution from the various Stuart kings. But not to get into the detail too much, I think his point about unionism as a means to preserve Scotland is entirely legitimate. And I think in its understanding in the period in question, like the late 17th century, the early 18th century, and even well into the 19th century, unionism functions as a means to emphasise Scotland. You know, we are, in fact, within Britain, but we are a separate place in and of itself too. And that's where I think this comment about Scotland being extinguished legally, that ironically, it undermines that unionist sentiment, because you start then you're getting into realms where, okay, well, you know, we have to start talking about North Britain again, or we have to start talking about Scotland as a region, or however you want to phrase it. I have some sympathy with Kidd's argument and with unionism broadly in terms of emphasising the position of Scotland as distinct. I think that's what it depends on, in fact. And so arguments to the contrary are I think, not helpful to that cause.
You know, that's interesting, and actually that brings us perhaps nicely on to something else I wanted to ask you about, Craig, because I am, I suppose, a bit of a skeptic in terms of the question about whether Scottish nationalism is primarily historically driven. I think there's a kind of minimal content of history, namely we've got this legacy of the idea that we are Scots, which is, you know, finds expression in loads of sort of different social distinctiveness and different public discourse, different language, whatever. We've got a kind of historical legacy there, but actually I find that Scots and my own education in terms of history was very thin. I really did almost no history from Scotland when I was in school. I learned a great deal about Germany, very obsessive about the fate of Germany. But not so much really about nothing. I did no Scottish history in my secondary school, which I think is just extraordinary. And so I wonder, is it just me, or do you think that there is something to this idea that the sort of Scottish nationalist argument isn't terrifically driven by historical sensibilities?
I think your point about the education system is not, in fact, related just to you, Andrew. I always talk about my experience of history in high school as there was the Wars of Independence, William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, then there was Culloden, and then there was Britain. And so those kind of two big events in Scottish history, winning your independence and then supposedly losing it, although the Jacobite rebellion is more complicated than it's often presented. I think there's no question that most Scots of our generation and older have been less exposed to Scottish history than, say, someone living in England might be exposed to certain aspects of English history.
In my school, we did, like you said, the Wars of Independence, and then apparently nothing at all happened to the Industrial Revolution until the Industrial Revolution. And there was absolutely no mention of the Act of Union. There was no mention of things like the Rebellion of 1820. After 1745, everything was all fine and dandy. To be honest, that wasn't even mentioned. And the only thing of sort of Scottish note in the history room, I still remember this, was pictures of like the Battle of Stirling with like troop, you know, those kind of troop movement posters with the horses moving around here and these going over there.
Yeah.
And you think, but just the total lack of Scottish history. I mean, at this point, do you have to think it's deliberate?
I must say I went at that too, because I went to a rather ghastly Glaswegian private school, and I often assumed that we were being turned into nice little pro-unionist people, and therefore would not, we didn't do Scottish literature either. Sorry, Craig.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think the question of deliberateness is interesting, because the Scottish government, I think, would buy that. I've also met Mike Rossall, the education minister. I met him last year at a conference I went to in Edinburgh.